And yeah, starting, hold on. All right, cool. Assuming I'm still audible, PYs to chat. Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. Affirmative is completely out of this debate because of three debate technicalities that they never stick to in a THR motion. A, they never give us a count of actual, in the absence of which we never understand as to why these harms accrue out of this particular narrative in the very first place. But secondly, not telling us as to why this feedback loop does not apply to your side, because you never tell us what this world would have looked like in the absence of this particular narrative. But secondly, telling us that how this narrative has harmed society in a retrospective sense. This is a THR motion. You are regretting something only after you do something, right? So tell us that what necessarily has happened in the past in this particular society, what led to this regret. But secondly, tell us that why this regret would not have existed in the absence of this narrative in the very first place. But thirdly, come up and prove that why this narrative is going to be so much overarching and dominating at all points of time to accrue to these harms in the very first place. So you can't come up and assert these particular things by saying that, look, you will be caught up in a feedback loop and you will just ignore these emotions out and you will just choose to engage in positive emotions because people can ignore anger at all points of time. The first rebuttal to them looks like that, look, they're defeated on this motion in their own particular framing. Why? Because they themselves concede in PM that, look, people ignore anger at all points of time. Notice that how assertive this claim is, because people necessarily opt into anger at all points of time. It is very easy to opt into negative emotions like lust, like anger, like violence at all points of time, because it is the most immediate emotion out there. Because of that, we don't see as to why necessarily you should believe Prime Minister on the framing that, look, people ignore negative emotions, they're just going to, let's say, believe on, let's say, positive emotion. If this is the case, I don't see as to why CA team set up this motion, because in the absence of that, I don't see a charitable debate happening on that. Because of that, I believe that for this debate to be a charitable, you necessarily need to concede that, look, people give in to emotions which are most immediate to them and most proximate to them. Versus on our side, you think of it a more rational and the more you take off more time to actually think out that process to a greater degree. Because of that, engage on the trade-off to actually make this debate more engaging. Before that, what is the first piece of clarification and framing that you get from opposition in the very first place? Notice how necessarily emotions exist on both sides. This debate is particularly about that whether or not emotion should be involved in a decision-making process or not. Notice that how necessarily what kind of decisions are we talking about? It's not about a small decision, let's say, just buying a samosa, right? It's about a big decision which can look like involving a lot of trade-offs and, let's say, a lot of stakes in the very first place. But secondly, this motion is more about on their side, necessarily you lack this particular lack of empathy, and anger and lust and violence is something that creates more harm in society. Because of that, we believe that the impact of acting on negative emotions is something this debate is more about rather than positive emotions. Why? Because of two reasons. A, because the impact of negative emotions is any day more larger than positive emotions. But secondly, notice how necessarily the impact of negative emotions is more on vulnerable people, because by the use of privilege, you can at any point of time press down these people and, let's say, make their situation more vulnerable by, let's say, acting on them by anger, by acting on them by privilege and violence at the same time. Because of that, this debate is more about acting on negative emotions rather than positive emotions. On that, PM is out. On that, we believe that what is the first framing that you get from opposition? Notice that how necessarily emotions are unreliable. Why? Because of two reasons. A, they're dynamic, but secondly, they're subjective. What is the reason that I give to back this analysis up? Notice how necessarily is subjective all points of time, because all emotions are a subjective, let's say, function of a lived experience. This can look like if a particular person has a traumatic experience in the very first place, if a particular person has, let's say, went through a lot of heartbreaks and divorces, and let's say they've gotten a negative conditioning in the very first place, they're more likely to act on the basis of that. Why? Because it looks like that, look, if you're a Hindu Savarna person, and if you're given that core conditioning that, look, all Dalits are going to be bad and all Muslims are bad in the very first place, you're more likely to act in a negative way whenever you see a Muslim compared to a positive way, because the biggest emotional response that you have when you see a Muslim is that, look, my conditioning told me in the very first place that, look, Muslims are bad. Because of that, I will believe my conditioning rather than an objective thinking process that, look, everyone should be just based on regardless of their identity and race in the very first place. Because of that, we believe that traumatic experiences, traumatic lived experiences, heartbreaks, divorces, and conditioning have a huge factor into making, let's say, emotions subjective from person to person. Why is this bad? Because notice that how necessarily it makes emotion unreliable as fuck. Notice how necessarily how one person will react to a particular emotion or a particular decision is sometimes going to be very any day subjective, and, let's say, any day independent of, let's say, how the other person reacts. This is particularly bad because necessarily how you factor into conditioning, how it makes very much difficult for you to, let's say, break out of a familiar conditioning at all points of time is something that's going to be particularly bad. But secondly, it is going to be dynamic at all points of time. Why is it going to be bad? Because notice how necessarily the way you feel about a certain thing or a situation changes over time. If necessarily I feel bad about Keshav for a particular thing, that will be based on the exposure of information that I have about Keshav. Because of that, we believe that the way about you feel about a certain thing is dependent upon your mood, but secondly, the reaction of the other person, but thirdly, on the basis of exposure to information that you have about a particular thing. Because of that, we believe that if you are feeling happy about a particular thing today, you're more likely to feel sad about it tomorrow based on a certain aspect, based on a certain reaction that you get from the other person. Why is this bad? Because it leads to regret in status quo, because people often change the way they feel about a certain thing. Because of that, we believe factoring such a thing into a decision making process leads to more regrettable decisions within status quo. Because of that, we believe that the most ideal making decision process involves two things: A, minimizing the amount of regret, but secondly, maximizing the amount of fulfillment. This fulfillment can be of two types. A, it can be of deontological fulfillment in terms of prioritizing family over job. It does not necessarily mean a utilitarian fulfillment, but can also look like a utilitarian fulfillment in terms of monetary fulfillment, which can look like aligning with what you deem important and what you really want as an actor. That is what an ideal decision making process looks like, and hence PM is out again. Because of that, we believe that on government's world, what does a decision making process will look like if you act upon emotions? A, you receive an action or a situation in very first place on government's world. You receive that action, and that creates a stimulus inside your body and your heart in the very first place. Because of that, based on acting on that stimulus, on that first response, on that first emotive response that comes natural to you, you are acting upon that on government's world. If let's say people are tending to feel angry on government's world based on a certain thing, they will act on that anger without thinking that what the repercussions of that will look like. Based on that, we believe that people on government's world act solely on the basis of that first emotive response. Based on that, they act on the just particular response without thinking what can be the outcomes of that can look like. So on that, they come up and try to talk about in PM that look, you will emotions act as a feedback mechanism in terms of what you really want. What you really feel right now is something that they've missed out on in PM's world. Because of that, we believe that if necessary you're feeling angry about a certain thing, you're more likely to beat up a friend rather than talking to him about it. You're more likely to, let's say, break up with a partner rather than talking to him about it. Because of that, we believe that you act on the first emotive response on government's world when you involve emotions. On our world, what do? Based on that, we believe that on our world, you think based on a rational. You think more on based on the long-term relation. You based on more on a long-term basis. But thirdly, you think on based on what you really want. Because of that, we believe that you actually weigh in what can lead to this if I do this, what can lead to this if I do that. On the basis of that, we believe that you actually see what your capacity is. But secondly, you see what your priorities are. But thirdly, you see that you back the decision up by a certain way, so that even if you, let's say, regret in a worst possible case in the future, you actually have some sort of rationale to back that up. You never have that in government world. Because of that, this motion should fall. Because of that, we believe that we do not want it to be an overarching negative. We want people to take time for themselves and then weigh pros and cons before taking a decision. Because of that, we believe that when you have a more structured and thought out way of making decisions, you make it less regrettable. But secondly, you're more prepared for the consequence of a decision on the bad basis. Because of that, when you really realize what you really want, because of that, you really realize what is more important for you in the long term. Well, when you realize what the capacity is, based on that, you take better decisions. But why is it principally important for, let's say, the minorities too? Because necessarily minorities are the ones who necessarily have limited capital in the status quo. Based on that, they really need to realize that what are their actual capacities. But secondly, what will happen if they, let's say, engage in retaliation directly, and let's say if the state comes up and let's screws them over tomorrow. Because of that, we believe that it's very important to have a more structured and let's say more structured way and more thought out way to taking decisions rather than just acting on that first emotive response. Based on that, the three impacts that we give you stand on that. Very proud to oppose.
Wonderful. I thank the speaker for that fine speech. DPM, when we are ready, here.
Hi, I'll begin in like 30 seconds, but before that, can you confirm I'm audible?
Yes, you're perfectly audible.
All right, beginning in three, two, one, go. Opposition has to debate a world where there is complete exclusion of emotions from a decision making process. Look at the wording of the motion. Whereas government can debate an inclusion of emotions. This inclusion doesn't mean that there is a complete overpowering of emotions where our entire decision making process is just filled with like heavy emotions or like anything that sort of like instigates that amount of anger or passion or ambition in somebody. Rather, they'll have to give us a better reasoning as to the point at which that these emotions exist. These emotions are far more likely to drive over every other stimuli, environmental stimuli that can possibly affect a decision making process. We don't see the problem where people have to maintain a distance from friends and a fear of trusting individuals, right? Because this is the kind of examples that they give, right? That they want people to go and put themselves out there. But rather, we'd actually prefer to live in a world where people are conscious of the life experiences that they've been through, they've gone through, because these life experiences have taught them a certain lesson, which means that we'd rather have them protect themselves, protect their mind and heart from getting hurt again, which is in our own way, which is literally our body telling ourselves to protect our own mental health. And we don't see as to why everyone just would want to put themselves out there and why that world would particularly look better. Prejudicial conditioning is something that goes above emotions, right? It is a belief system that is ingrained in you from an age. You therefore feel like discriminating against a Muslim is the rational thing to do. Rather, we do not see as to why this discrimination particularly comes into play, because discrimination is driven by belief systems and not emotions. So let's talk about what this debate is really about. And I'm going to particularly talk this debate in a contrast. Like, I'll talk about what our world looks like, where emotions aren't censored. We allow ourselves to make decisions based off even on emotions that have a negative connotation attached to them, for example, like anxiety, insecurity, and even hysteria, because inevitably we see these emotions are seen as weaknesses in status quo, and we force ourselves to let go of these emotions and only allow some skewed sense of rationality to prevail. And I'll elaborate as to why I say skewed, because emotions in itself, and this is something you do hear from the Prime Minister, and it's completely ignored, as to why emotions in itself are a continual cognitive appraisal process that exists within us. This loop in itself demonstrates how emotions underpin many more decisions than simply basing them off a strong feeling. This appraisal system that is ingrained within our body has evolved for survival, and it forms on the basis of rationality and decision making, because the emotions are a way of our body to communicate with us based on the things that it's been through, based on the life experiences it has, and based on what kind of acts that we should do and what kind of people that we should trust. We do not see any case scenario where this kind of an appraisal system should be completely left out and only some skewed sense of rationality should prevail in making decisions. So let's talk about what is our way of determining if a decision is good for an individual. Is it possible to even actually set an objective metric of what a good and bad decision is in every case? Different people have different preferences with regard to what they want in life, what they need, and what they like on a regular basis, or what they don't like, what they perceive their goal in life to be. So we cannot always be claiming that there is some objective sense of rationality of X over Y that prevails, which is good for you, irrespective of who you are and what life experiences you've had. We'd rather believe that emotions in itself are a way of depicting our life experiences and keeping them in mind while comprehending different decisions. Different people operate under different kinds of priority rules, and thus different kind of emotions. We cannot posit that a certain set of preferences is by default good for you, because you're the only person who knows everything about your life and you know all the circumstances, situations, and responsibilities. So the good decision that you make is something that you make in conclusion with all the kinds of things that you've experienced, with kind of emotions that you feel, and what you reproduce after that. This was also elaborately explained in the previous speaker, but what I'll particularly do in this debate is talk about the contrast between the two worlds and prove to you that in a world where this narrative does not exist, we're far better off to embrace our emotions and understand and reflect on them accordingly. But firstly, on their side of the world, women are often sidelined from areas of politics and corporate leadership, etc., because any kind of emotion that they display in terms of, say, giving a passionate speech, having ambition, or even fear is seen as a form of weakness and something that is enough of a justification to refuse them opportunities. And the point at which we give an opportunity to somebody who is able to embrace their ideas of what the world should look like and make decisions based on their own ideas and own happiness, we believe in that world we see women We don't see women having an internal battle against themselves and constantly questioning as to why they feel what they feel. Rather, we see that in status quo, we often push this narrative, particularly on women, to make sure that they're constantly in a battle of questioning on whether or not they should feel this kind of emotion or they shouldn't. This looks like women not being able to converse with their, say, significant other because they believe that it can have a negative consequences, or pushing emotions of nervousness, insecurity, and jealousy aside because they've been forced to believe that they shouldn't be feeling this despite somebody's action actually warranting this kind of reaction. This looks like people making a variety of career decisions that can obviously, say, in a rational world, accelerate their growth, but at the same time increase their stress, increase their anxiety and their fear of failure, which means that at the expense of their own mental health and stability are we making these decisions just because society validates us or pushes ourselves to go to these extremes. So even if you get some materialistic value out of it, we'd rather not have it. Before I move on, POI.
If I'm
I'll
happy
wait
and
for 3 more
excited
seconds.
if I'm happy and excited and I go ahead and spend $1 million, the next time I feel happy, I'll regret that happiness. I won't experience that happiness to the maximum possible extent because I know I can fuck
All right,
up at
I understand. Okay. Your world is status quo, right? In status quo, people that are happy do make these kinds of decisions anyway. Rather, according to your previous speaker, you're particularly concentrating your entire motion around negative emotions of stress, anxiety, and anger. So your POI in itself defeats your LO speech. Moving on, let's talk about the fact what we trade off in this debate, right? Even if we prove to you, even if we say that, say, we rather value the mental health of people over, say, taking, say, advantageous decisions in their career, we're still okay with that because we put some value on the fact that even emotions like stress, anxiety, and insecurity have something important, and we'd rather have people actually embracing these emotions when they're making decisions, which means at the point at which we add value to your body's existence, we're seeing a world, and this is the counterfactual that we propose, where women aren't particularly sidelined for, say, supposedly being hysterical. We're seeing where people are not being forced to make career decisions just because it rationally seems sensible that taking upon more work is going to get you a quicker promotion. We're seeing people having more open communications within their relationships where they put value on things like insecurity and jealousy as well, and we can see as to what kind of, say, actions even warrant these reactions, and we're putting value to these reactions, which means at the point at which we're able to put some sort of we're able to prioritize our own mental health and put value on these emotions, we see people being far more satisfied with the decision that they make, and we see people making far better decisions, and for all these reasons, extremely proud to propose.
Wonderful. I thank the speaker for that fine speech. DLO, whenever you're ready, here.
Okay, is this clear? I hope there's no background noise from the fan.
Nope, you're perfectly audible and visible.
All right, thank you. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I'll just first deal with this analysis that they ask us of why emotions always drive decisions and predominantly will drive decisions. I think it's very simple. In engineering terms, it's known as short circuiting, because note, when you have the least amount of time to get to that decision making process, I think people just opt for that instinctively because it requires lesser brain power, because you don't have to give it second and third thoughts. It's a first emotive response that you act on. At that point of time, you're probably likely to act on this emotion because it's the most accessible to you, more proximate to you, because it comes from within you, and you don't have to use analysis like weighing up certain pros and cons in that side of the house. And that probably means that at all points likely to opt into this emotion and work with this emotion. That means this is something that's always going to predominate over decision making process. But note, I don't even have to do this analysis because they concede at DPM that people should embrace emotions, and there's just a narrative debate. That means at all points, this narrative, if you're embracing, means it's an overarching narrative, and people have to opt in this narrative, because if they don't, they feel that they're overthinking and overanalyzing stuff, and that is itself is just meant harmful for people, because they call themselves overthinkers or over analysts, and that's generally harmful. But this is just like taking out the debate land stuff, right? But firstly, on the idea of why emotions are a feedback loop and this is something good. Note, I think they conveniently skew this debate and say it's only about the positive emotions or the negative emotions, that positive emotions leading to good outcomes. I don't think that's necessarily true. I don't think any side can go ahead and prove to you like that, any sort of action will lead to obviously a better result. But on our side, we can just go ahead and tell you that the decision making process itself gets optimized analyze, and you later have lesser regret. I'll analyze that later, but firstly on the idea of experiencing emotions and making decisions based on emotions. I think these are two totally separate things. They don't necessarily are the same thing, because not experiencing emotion means that I get catharsis from the existence or my outpour of this particular emotion in front of others, or just in front of myself, right? If I'm alone at that point of time, and decision making means that you do something which might have a consequence, which can probably go ahead and change this emotive response what I have. If I'm angry, I probably want to do something that makes me less angry, and if I'm happy, I want to do something that makes me more happy. That's exactly where my POI becomes important, because if you are excited and happy, you probably gamble $1 million primarily because you feel that you will get more money, which will make you more happy. I think at that point of time, when you do end up fucking up, what happens is at a point you reach the regret point in your life, like after say 20 days or just after you lose that money immediately. What now becomes a problem is that you think that, okay, I acted on my emotions on their side of the house, and that's exactly why you can't rationalize that decision. On our side, when you have already weighed up your pros and cons, when you sideline that emotion for a second and you think whether I should do it in the first place or not, I think that generally, one, improves the decision making process, but secondly, it takes out the idea of regret and reduces regret to a large extent. Why it reduces regret is because you now play back the entire sequence in your head. You think about the thought process that you had, you gave it a second and third thought, and that you weighed up your pros and cons, and that led you to make the decision. I think when you can rationalize your decision in the face of regret, that leads to lesser regret and better mental health. But there's some extraneous rebuttals to their side. They say objectivity can't be set in society. Sure, we are not asking people to do that. I think everyone can set their own metrics, deontological or utilitarian. They're not asking people to go ahead and just do something and like this is something that's generally good, or it's not a liberal point of view. It's just that people can go ahead and define their own truths and realities, and I think we should allow people to go ahead and do that. But we are just asking people to go ahead and give it a second thought about the truths and realities, whether they question the truths and realities on their side. On their side, they just buy into this truth and realities, and that's a bigger problem. But just lastly on the idea of women, I think that's exceptionally harmful on their side, because they say that women can't converse because of things like them being called hysterical, or them being called, them having some sort of nervous and anxiety. This is exactly where the idea of embracing emotions plays into picture. Nervous and anxiety are also emotions, because they never deal with this idea that emotions can be negative also, right? They just exclude it out of the debate. Note, if you're anxious and you are nervous, you probably will, and you're embracing this idea instead of embracing your truth about how you're oppressed and you want to break out of the oppressive cycle. You want utility in terms of you getting financial autonomy from your husband or whatever. On their side, you like to just embrace this emotion and not think about that utility at that point of time, because at that point of time, you rather on comparative on our side, you probably like to think that, okay, I want this financial autonomy, that's why I need to sideline this emotion of anxiety and nervousness and go talk to this person. I think that exists on our side, so idea of women also goes out. Note what is Ashutosh is framing, and they miss this. Emotions are dynamic and subjective. That means my emotions can change. So at a point in time when my emotions can change, I possibly cannot fathom what I was thinking or what my emotion was at that point of time. When I'm extremely elated and happy, I can't imagine putting myself in the shoes when I'm actually angry. That lack of epistemic access that people have towards their previous emotions, this probably means that you probably can't rationalize those actions that you took when you were angry. This means that you have more regret on their side of the house as opposed to ours, right? And the idea of subjectivity, I think this is generally harmful. And since this is a regrets motion, we can easily tell you that in current society and status quo, which we are defending, note that there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of crime, there's a lot of crimes of passion that happen primarily because people act on their emotion in the first place, right? If someone breaks my heart, I don't think whether I'll go to jail by killing this person or throwing acid on this person, but I still do it. Why? Because I can't rationalize that thought at that point of time, because I'm giving out God given a second or third thought on their side of the house. When I act on this emotion and I embrace this emotion of hatred or lust for that matter, I probably end up ruining my life, and at that point I think I just go ahead and regret, why did I do this? And I can't even rationalize that answer, and that is just generally harmful for people. That means more regret on their side. And on our side, what you now do is you better experience emotions, because this feedback loop is not something that's present, right? So the next time I go ahead and opt into this emotion, I know that this won't affect my decision making process, right? I can probably go ahead and rationalize this thing. That means I can feel the full range of emotions, as opposed to using it as a feedback loop to go ahead and actually just go ahead and reduce the kind of emotion experience that I have, because I know that this feedback loop is stopping me, or the repercussions of this of this emotion led to a negative outcome that stopped me from going and do that before get POI. Sure.
If confrontation can actually lead to even more stress and trauma for somebody, why do you wish to override the anxiety?
I don't really get this question, because if people do go ahead and actually overcome the sideline the anxiety for a second, I think they can just make better decisions because they see the utility at the end of the day, right? I think just even if it goes ahead and ruins this person, I'll still say that it's better, because and here you bite the bullet that even if it's a bad thing and bad repercussion come, you regret it less because you now feel that at least you did your maximum as opposed to on your side, right? We tell you three impacts, second two impacts of this. Firstly, on personal relationships, that's generally harmful for personal relationships because you probably tend to act impulsively, and that's generally harmful because you probably regret that relation later. I think it all ties back to my analysis. But secondly, social justice movements, right? I think when you had things like farmers protest going ahead and actually vandalizing the Red Fort or whatever, that was an act of passion and that was an act of emotion. People acting on the emotions. What that led to was a negative repercussion of the entire protest literally being wiped out till the last minute. When the Jats came in and saved the protest. I think that is the thing that exists on their side of the house. They have to literally deal with that kind of violence and the kind of crime that exists in society, which is literally acts of passion and acts of impulsiveness. I think at that point in time, people even relate more to Kashmir files primarily because of the subconscious that they already have. I think emotions just reaffirm this subconscious. At that point in time, the filmmakers are not going ahead and actually showing people zero experiences. What they're rather going ahead and doing, they're banking on people going ahead and engaging on their emotion in the first place, and that's why they're selling this movie to them instead of telling actually what happened in Kashmir. I think this is the delta that exists on this debate, and that's the comparative IV which we win this debate on. Less regret, more happiness, better decision making process. All those reasons.
Wonderful. I thank the speaker for that fine speech. Kavvip, whenever you're ready, hear you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, you're perfectly audible.
Yeah, just give me 30 seconds and I will get started. Okay, sorry for that. Starting in three, two, one. I think opposition bench case in this debate has largely been limited to a variety of words that have been taken from a debate meta session on your locality, but I don't think there's been enough substantiation. I think I'm going to do three things in this speech. First, I'm going to tell you why is it that regret is not felt more on our side of the house. Second, I'm going to tell you why the short circuiting the opposition bench is so enthusiastic about is unlikely, and even if it happens, we think we're okay with trading that off. And third, we think that uh, third, I'm going to talk about social justice movements and why that clash is a wash, or at best it goes to us. I think that first of all, I think the opposition bench has just misunderstood the motion, the point at which they go ahead and argue that on our side of the house, you will make a decision out of anger and then feel regret about it. But bro, the regret is felt as a consequence of the narrative that pushes you towards rationality. We think you feel less regret on our side of the house for an angry decision because on opposition side, the social narrative that pushes you towards rationality and pushes you away from emotional instinct and uh, emotional, knee-jerk, quote unquote, that narrative is what makes you feel that regret. Because on their side of the house, the point at which you go ahead and take that angry, quote unquote, angry decision, on you go ahead and feel terrible about yourself for making that decision because of the fact that the narrative exists. On government world, by definition of this motion, if you make angry decisions, you do not really regret it because on our side of the world, you do not feel bad about yourself. You do not punish yourself. You do not tell yourself in that I should not have done that. You do not tell yourself in the head that was a bad thing, it was a wrong thing for me to do. We think that the absence of the narrative in this motion is by definition going to lead to less regret and people feeling better about their decisions in general. So on our side of the house, people feel better about our decisions. And the next question is, where do people make better decisions, right? I think that let's take the example of let's take the example of short circuiting around that analysis around. I think that on the problem is that this is essentially government worst case, right? Wherein you go ahead and break up with your partner directly, the point at which you go ahead and see your partner doing something angry. I think that number one, this is unlikely. You might experience an immediate emotion, but there is no reason why that immediate emotional response clouds everything else that you need to consider at that particular situation. You might feel angry on seeing your partner do something that you think is wrong, but we think that like the way in which the brain works is a lot faster than the way in which our actions respond to it, and therefore if emoting is the first immediate response to a particular situation, that is often immediately followed by rationalizing. That means to say that you then ask yourself, why is it that my partner is doing this? Have they been disloyal to me in the past? Is this the first time that it's happening? Is it the past? What have I been missing out on, etc., etc., etc.? A whole lot of questions come up in your head, right? We think that it's perfectly possible for you to feel all of these, to feel a significant amount of anger at the same time as experiencing all of these questions inside of your head, right? We think that uh, this is something that there is a state of mind that is symmetric on both sides of the house. On their side, what happens is that these people tell themselves that they are being insecure and unnecessarily angry, and then they do not go ahead and have a conversation with their partner, because on their side of the house they are told that they should be rational about it. They're told that they should consider the circumstance and all of that stuff. On our side of the house, you go ahead and allow yourself to feel that anger, right? We think that that anger coupled of the rationalization that you're doing on your head decides to go ahead you then decide to go ahead and act based on that mixture of anger and the questions that you have in your head. I think that the world that government has to defend is a world where you do not exclusively make decisions based on emotions, but you are including it in your decision making process. I don't think that just because your quote unquote quickest way of reaching a particular endpoint is the one that is your immediate emotional response is the reason why, like, the brain doesn't work like a circuit is my point. You do not always minimize brain power the point at which you go ahead and act on the on an angry emotional response, because the emotion that caused it is going to linger in your head for a long time after you go ahead and take that decision. The point therefore is that the quote unquote short circuiting that government bench or opposition bench argues is very very unlikely, and you do not necessarily minimize brain power for that particular decision, because your brain is fine tuned to simultaneously feeling anger and asking yourself several questions about it. But you know what, even if it is true that if even if it is true that the immediate emotion is so overpowering that you consider that anger is the only thing that does, we think that at that point you are entitled to feeling better by making that decision, right? We think that is likely to happen only in the case where you feel better after it, and we think that's fine, because it's very difficult to set objective metrics for what a good or a bad decision. We think in any case we think that it just depends on who you are as a person, and therefore the good decision is the one that makes you feel better about it. The conclusion therefore is that you feel better about your decisions on our side, and that since the better decision is the one that makes you feel better, you make better decisions on our side of the house. I'm going to give some extraneous rebuttal, but before that, I need you.
Yep. So in a regrets motion, retrospectively tell us what are the benefits what are the harms that have accrued due to emotion, due to ideal decision making process. Because we told you kinds of passion, and violence exist in society.
Okay, so if your problem is with violence, I think that insofar as the example that you came up with was just farmer protest violence and all that. We think that those acts of violence are an expression of self-defense, because those are people who have been disenfranchised in society and have nowhere else to go, and therefore those acts of violence are legitimate. We think that on your side of the house, those acts of violence are actually censored by media as angry anti-national mob attacking a national institution. But we think on our side of the house that is much less likely to happen, because people think of people think it's okay to go ahead and make angry decisions. I think that's just the difference in this debate. On our side of the house, it's okay to go ahead and make a decision based on your anger. Retrospectively, I think that on government world is a world where people feel much more regret about making a certain decision, and also make less informed decision. The point at which they cloud emotions, they actively attempt to cloud emotions out of their judgment. They actively attempt to not let themselves be quote unquote carried away by a certain emotion. We think that that is unfortunate, and we think that on our side of the house is our side of the house is the world where people feel better about their decision making. I think that they go ahead and argue. Their response to our argument about women and the way they are treated is that women will do better when they go ahead and sideline anxiety and go ahead and confront people and get promotions and all that. I think that's an extremely uh, tedious and a difficult experience for individual women to go through. That is exactly your point. Your mental health is better on our side of the house.
Are done in that done in idle process. Why? Even in terms of the impacting, it literally fucks everything over. In terms of the personal relationship, that it fucks over, as in how you are no longer, when you let, as in how anger, my senior, and my the relationship that we hold now, if I were to let the anger take over me, for that matter, is necessarily hampering the personal relationship that I have with anger, for that matter. Similarly, in SGMs as well, in social justice movement, when this particular emotion, act of passion, is something that takes over, the violence is something that emerges out of it. Whether it be CAA protest that took place, whether it be about the farmers protest that took place, whether it be any protest that took place, it's the sort of anger and the sort of art of passion that takes place over the fact, the feeling of that, when it takes place or takes precedent over you having a complete or giving complete understanding of ideation or this decision making. It fucks the complete social justice movement as a whole, as in terms of where this particular farmers movement was literally at the verge of getting swiped out because of lathi charge. The anti-CAA protest is literally something that like literally ended in half of the northeastern Delhi being burnt, like in a broad day light, for that matter. Insofar, if these are the repercussions that are tagged along, and insofar if SGM is far likely to get worse, personal relationships are going to be less get worse, and how everything is literally fucking worse, like you don't even have proper rationale for your own decision. We don't think that decision making should ever encapsulate emotions, for that matter. But also on the technicalities, proposition not even ever fulfills the primary burdens of proofs. Never been more proud of to oppose.
Wonderful. I thank the speaker for that fine speech, and that brings us to the end of the constructive part of the debate. Would the speakers like a common minute before they reply?
No, ops good.
Cup, would you like a common minute? Perfect.
No, it's
Op, reply whenever you're ready. Here.
All right, just confirming quickly if I'm clear.
So perfectly audible.
All right. Funny, it's fine. Got. Sorry about that. This light just went out anyway. I'm going to continue. Don't open the door. Don't open the door. Don't open the door, bhai. Please. Yes. Okay. Cool. All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I think what we have proven to you sufficiently on our side of the house is that when there is a when you regret this narrative, what it leads to is that more people acting on their emotions. Just a second. Can you pause? Yep. I think one of the panel members dropped in and joined. I'm not sure if they're here or if it's a network issue. It was Mitansh, I think. Can they confirm if they are here?
Hi, Mitansh, are you here?
I'm sorry, I'm so confused. Whom are we waiting for? Like, I'm confused. Like, who is it that we're asking around?
Mithansh, it seems that they disconnected and then rejoined, so Opera just wants to know whether they're here or not.
Yeah, Mitansh, if you could confirm, like, where you got disconnected as well.
Could someone reach out to them over WhatsApp perhaps and just see if they're here or not? OC, could you do that?
Hello, is anyone speaking?
No, we're waiting on a panelist to confirm their presence. As soon as they do so, we'll begin.
Hey, so what to be the issue is that Mitansh keeps joining and then like dropping off the call and then trying to rejoin. Shrishti, if it's possible, could you try and like call Mitansh in like a regular call and just confirm what the issue is so we know?
Oh, alright, Mithansh is here. They had some net issues in college, but it's sorted now. Op reply, you can begin. Yeah.
All right. Starting again in three, two, one. What we have sufficiently proven to you in this debate is the counterfactual is worse. That means when people always opt for things that are emotive responses, then they always embrace their emotions, they're likely to cause more violence and more like crimes of passion existing. I think that was the comparative they had to defend, and they had to prove to us. I think Keshav explicitly mentions this and beautifully points it out, that why people are likely to why people want this immediate satisfaction in the form of immediate utility and quick utility, as opposed to a rationalized process that they can probably go ahead and not regret more on our side, right? I think that was the debate that should have happened. I think they just shrugged off the burden of the counterfactual and just gave us like probabilistic regret metrics of what could happen. I don't think that's necessarily true. But note what we have given to you in this debate, and this is very crucial. I think the first clash that existed was on the idea of regret. I think we proved to you through sufficient analysis that why there's less regret, because you can rationalize your decisions to yourself once you reach that point of regret on our side of the house, right? Because you know the exact process you went through, about your thought process, about the weighing of pros and cons, about the either deontological or utilitarian metrics that you use to make that particular decision on our side of the house. On their side, when it's an overarching narrative which you already always embrace, on their side, when it's like the first emotive response that you opt into, you can't rationalize yourself that particular regret or the existence of the repercussion which probably is poor, because I think this debate primarily revolves around those poor repercussions and those negative emotions. Why? I think we have given to you a weighing of this, right? Since there's more, the violence is something that causes more harm to you as well as to others, and those negative repercussions are something that no one wants to opt for because literally they are labeled negative. I think at that point of time they just weigh up over the positive impacts. I don't think positive impacts are like then being challenged by their side. I think they just agree that positive impacts are symmetric, but we have proved to you that why negative emotions are something that's more harmful. But note on their side of the house, when you just opt for things that are emotive in response, you can't rationalize your regret to yourself at that point because you don't have epistemic access to know what you were feeling at that point. But even if you do, I think you just generally feel that, oh, it was an impulsive reaction, that's why I couldn't control it. And regret itself being an emotion is something that you can't possibly go ahead and now justify to yourself. I think this is a harm that exists on their side, which is never dealt with. But second clash was about the idea of better decision making. I think we proved this to you as well, that better decision making exists on our side primarily because you give it a thought. So even if the repercussion is bad, the decision making process itself gets optimized and better. Why? Because now you think about it a second, like 2 or 3 times, and you might end up like looking at your other metrics that you've set, utilitarian or ontological. I think those metrics, let's on a probabilistic scenario, are like better served on our side because there's a possibility that you opt for those. On their side of the house, since they have already conceded to this fact that there's going to be an overarching narrative, they had to prove sufficiently why always emotions are better off, right? I don't think they can skew the debate and say, oh, it's just like whether emotions should exist or not, it's free choice for people. I think we have proven this to you as well, that when it's a narrative and people always have to opt into this narrative because they don't want to be seen as overthinkers about a certain thing, and also because if the entire case is literally contingent on this idea of you embracing emotions, I think that at that point they probably are right in that approach. So about their burden, so that means they already conceded to their own framing. So I don't think their idea of like skewing the debate into choice is something that exists. I think the panelists have dropped off, but I'm going to continue anyway. So lastly, on the idea of impacting, I think on their side of the house, you reaffirm the biases because the analysis of social justice movement is something that exists on our side, primarily because of this idea that when you have social justice movement opting into things like emotions, you probably create more violence. On their side of the house, this is something that exists. On our side, you probably like to think twice or thrice, and you would like to discuss these things with your other people, and that's why you probably won't opt violence because you see a negative repercussion to this. I think that the perception of negative repercussion stops you from making a poor decision, and that's something that's extremely important for social justice movement, one, but secondly for personal relationships. I think to that extent, the reaffirmation of biases that exist on government side is something that they never deal with. I think we gave you sufficient analysis for all those three reasons why you should not get this motion. They never deal with the idea of counterfactual. They never engage with the case. For all those reasons, opt.
Wonderful. I thank the speaker for that fine speech. Cover up live whenever you're ready. Here.
I'm just checking, am I audible?
Yes, you're perfectly audible.
Yeah, cool. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, if opposition wants us to defend crimes of passion, then by their equivalent metric, they will have to defend nurses dying because they choose to overwork themselves because it was more rational for you to get some extra money to support your family. So let's be a little more charitable than opposition, and let's look at this debate from a realistic perspective, the way people make decisions and the different aspects of decision making that they take into account while finally figuring out what to do at the end of the day, right? In opposition's world, like opposition world is basically status quo, at the point at which people are shamed for like taking negative emotions into account while they make their decisions. What did we tell you was a counterfactual? Shubneet's entire speech was literally characterizing that counterfactual to them again so that they understand it, but they constantly claimed that there was no counterfactual. I'm going to do that to you once more so that Op gets it. The counterfactual is that when we put value to emotions on our side of the world, where people are able to prioritize and protect their mental health at the end of the day, and women who are not sidelined as hysterical in their emotions are actually taken into account, and in general, decisions are made while taking into considerations emotions like anger and anxiety as legitimate. Look at the examples that opposition wanted to argue, though, right? They wanted to talk about things like protest. They wanted to talk about like toxic masculinity and people asserting their influence using violence and stuff of that sort, right? And Not that the examples were weird just to start out with right there. Protests are the worst example because on their side of the house, you're delegitimizing the anger and the oppression that people have faced, that is protesters have faced at the end of the day, right? We think that is extremely weird. A more reasonable decision that people have to make based on anger is probably like whether they go shout at that person or not, whether they go confront that person or not, rather than whether I take a knife and kill that individual, right? So it's an extreme emotions, and at the point, like I don't think either side of the house can go ahead and tell people not to feel extreme emotions that come in like the heat of the moment. That is very different. Like there's a huge difference between the kind of emotions that people actually like factor into decision making and like the narrative actually affects at the end of the day, right? Which is why we think opposition's entire set of examples and every characterization where they came from was literally the edge of this debate and does not really make a difference in terms of helping their case. The second thing that we told you in terms of a counterfactual is that you allow yourself to process the information and the emotion that you from the emotion that you experience and act on the basis of this information. This was the premise of our argument in the first piece, right? We told you that emotions give you some sort of information that you can't access through external sources, is uniquely available to you and talks about your instincts, which means it understands, say, the way you act and the way you feel about things way better than almost anything else. If the premise is that we like more information means that we get better decisions, it's going to be so much more effective and so much more better at the point at which you're able to use this information and factor it into the decision making process, right? There was absolutely no rebuttal from opposition on the basis of this. The only problem that they had with emotions is that it's impulsive, it changes, which means people will go ahead and regret it, right? But what response did we give to you with respect to that? And this is the final thing that opposition missed in this debate. We want people to have inhibitions when they go ahead and try to trust people, right? We want you to take into account the anxiety and trauma that you've faced before you go ahead and confront them. We don't think that, like, if the rational decision is going ahead and confronting your boss, we don't think that's something you need to do at the point at which you're going to feel like a shit person when you go back home. You're going to feel really sad. You're going to feel anxious every time you walk past that individual in your workplace and things like that, right? These are the kind of decisions where people actually sit down, think, and make, which is why we don't understand what exactly opposition argued. Finally, just to summarize what our world looks like, we live in a world where emotions are considered legitimate, especially these negative emotions. They factor into that decision making with that extra information that you have, which means when you sit down and think about things, you will be like, I feel sad. It is legitimate for me to feel sad, which means I will not do this thing. It's not that I feel angry, I'm going to go kill someone out in the street. That is absolutely unreasonable. Op loses this debate right there.
Wonderful. I thank the speaker for the fine speech and all the speakers for a very wonderful debate. We will not be announcing the results right now. They'll be announced at the closing ceremony. Could my panelists please join me in the results discussion room of Debate Room 1 on the Trivium Discord server? Thank you so
Yeah, I
much.
will join you in debate room 1. Thank you everyone for the debate.
Prosper.
Thank you for the debate.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, guys.